I watched a quilting video earlier today that absolutely struck a nerve. It was about the realistic cost of a handmade queen size quilt. And the reason that I got so negative about this video is because when I first started to get interested in quilting, I was told by a well meaning family member that I could not possibly afford to quilt. And the logic that she was using, she was misinformed and figured that out once I did start quilting, but it was the same logic as in this video. And I understand the point of the video was that you can't expect to purchase a handmade quilt for what someone who knows nothing about quilting or how many hours it takes would think that it's worth. The example she used was someone who told her they'd pay even $75 for that quilt. And of course, that math doesn't work. But she calculated the materials for a queen size quilt, came up with $400 and some just in materials and quilting, and then another $1,200 in labor. And someone who watches that, I'm afraid, is going to think that they can't afford to make a quilt because they don't have $400 in materials. There are a lot of cheaper ways if you are making a quilt for yourself or a quilt that you really want to make to give as a gift. The fabric in the example that the other YouTuber used was all a designer collection from a quilt shop. You can use fabric from the craft store. You can use sheets from the thrift store. You can use men's cotton shirts from a family member. You can also use women's shirts, but some of those have some lycra and spandex in them, so check your materials a little more closely there. You can back your quilts with sheets. I did a video a while back talking about a quilt that I made, and it was my birthday, and I made myself a quilt as an experiment and tried to see how cheap I could make that 60 by 60 inch quilt, which is a remarkably similar design to the one in the other video. And I came out doing it in under $30. That was about 8 years ago. So if you double or triple the cost, it still doesn't come anywhere near her numbers, even if you do adjust for 8 years having passed. If you want to make a quilt, look at what materials you have available to you. There are a lot of options that aren't from the quilt shop. If you want to make a quilt with a designer line of fabric, I've done it. There are fabrics I love that much. It's going to be expensive, but that is not your only option. You do not have to pay a long armor to quilt your quilt. You can, with some practice, and there is definitely a learning curve, but you can quilt a queen size quilt on your domestic sewing machine. I've done it. It's not the most practical thing, but it's possible. I've done it before, and I will probably do it again. You can tie the quilt. Like, think the old-fashioned ones that great-grandma made where they just have the little ties of string every so many inches. That's a perfectly legitimate way of finishing a quilt. If you were really inspired and really didn't want to do it on a sewing machine, you could always hand quilt a quilt. We're not going to talk about how many hours that would take. I don't break down my projects into how many hours they take, unless it's just out of curiosity or I'm trying to figure out how long it will take to replicate that project. This is a hobby for me. I don't look at it as the value of my labor. I make quilts, I donate them. I do not for an instant think of how many hours was that and how much would that have been worth, because that is not the point of what I'm doing. If you want to quilt and someone has told you it is way too expensive, take a look at your other options. I am not picking on this YouTuber because I looked at the rest of her channel later after rewatching the original video that set me off, and she has got a lot of videos about actual economical quilting, and I do understand her point that there is nobody who should be making a queen size quilt and selling it for $75 or $100 or $200 or any other unrealistic price. Handmade, handcrafted items tend to be expensive, and there's a reason for that. Let me know, do you sell your work? Do you calculate your hours if you're giving something as a gift? Because that seemed to be a matter of discussion in her comment section. I'd love to hear about it. Thanks for watching. I'm Michelle. This is my romantic tangle.